All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is the third part of our look at the United Nations system, part three. This is going to be a shorter presentation than we've had before, which I think that most of you will be very happy with. We have already looked at the 7 branches of the United Nations, ending with the Secretariat. In fact, our Secretariat here at Whitney High School. And how I want to end this is by sharing with you what the United Nations actually does and give you a small sample of topics the United Nations has been involved with. This is not an exhausted list. There are, in fact, scores more than are in this video and in the illustrations that you see up online. But this is just to give you an example of the many, many different topics that you'll be coming across when you do an MUN conference. I'm not going to look at all of these topics in detail because we'll be here for 2 weeks on it or so. I'm just going to go very, very quickly to show you what the United Nations has been doing and maybe highlight a few things. To begin with, it helps to promote democracy, allowing for people to be able to make decisions in their own world, maintains peace and security, which of course is very important. It's doing a good job. We haven't had a nuclear war yet. It helps to make peace. The United Nations is responsible for keeping the peace in many parts of the world. It promotes development, making sure that countries can rise to a higher standard of living. It promotes human rights, with the Declaration of Human Rights, which you can see Eleanor Roosevelt holding up there. There are official rights that can and should never be violated. It's working to protect the environment, to prevent nuclear proliferation. I mean, you know, if everybody had nukes, we're going to be in big trouble. It has helped to promote self-determination and independence. You knew about that. It's strengthening international law, making sure that when you move from one country to the other, that the laws are similar, or that, excuse me, or that if you're accused of a crime, you can then get solace and help from your own country. If countries are arguing about things, it will help to judge the disputes. It provides international aid, and it is aiding refugees. In fact, refugees is a topic you'll find at almost every single MUN conference that you can go to. It promotes the rights of women, who of course are not treated well around the world. It provides safe drinking water. They should come down to Flint, Michigan, huh? It has eradicated smallpox, which has killed more people than any other disease. It presses for universal immunization. In fact, they have just eliminated polio in Africa. There's only 2 parts in the world where people can still get polio in the wild, and that is Pakistan and Afghanistan. It reduces child mortality rates because no one wants children to die. It fights against parasitic diseases, which can be pretty nasty. This is looks like this child in the picture has a man in the picture, excuse me, has some type of worms. It promotes investment into countries so that people can make money on their own, reduces the effects of natural disasters, an earthquake or something like that. What important thing it needs to do and still continue to do, clears landmines. It's been clearing landmines down in the Middle East for decades after the war in the Persian Gulf. It has been protecting the ozone layer. Unfortunately, things have gotten worse. It's curbing global warming or climate change, although the major nations of the world don't seem to be interested in doing it. This may be the reason why we're going to have very hot temperatures this weekend. It prevents overfishing so that people can still have reserves of fish and other marine life for consumption and not get rid of it all. It's limiting deforestation. The Amazon rainforest is a good example here. UN helps to clean pollution. It protects consumer health so that medicine that you buy, let's say, from Canada is just as good as its counterpart in India, Pakistan, or here in the United States. One of its biggest jobs, it helps to fight drug abuse, and we all know what that is. It helps to improve global trade, because the more we trade with one another, in the end, the richer we all get and the better we all do. It helps to promote economic reform so that nations that have problems with their banking, for example, and people are losing money or perhaps it's being stolen, will be able to recover it. It promotes the right of workers. Of course, worker rights is something that many people don't have in their countries. Helps to improve agricultural techniques so we can grow more in less area. It promotes the safety in the oceans. It improves air and sea travel. I mean, there's nothing worse than having an airplane fall on you. We just had the anniversary on the 31st, a few days ago, of the Aeroflot Mexico flight that fell on the city of Cerritos. If you didn't know about that, an airplane flew, killed 80 some more people, including like 15 people on the ground. The plane literally came down 4 houses from where I am. I'm on Carmenita. I'm just off of Carmenita, so when you hear a car go by, that's Carmenita Road. It protects, but there have been no big crashes since then, partially because of the United Nations. It protects intellectual property, so if you come up with a great new computer game and you're making the bucks, it keeps people like you from stealing the games and then playing it for free without any compensation. Not that you steal any intellectual property, right? None of you steals music. None of you steals video games, right? It promotes the free flow of information. We know, for example, of China's firewall that only allows certain websites to come into that country. The United Nations and its allied countries are against that. Finally, it facilitates academic and culture exchanges so people can find out more about each other. It improves literacy for women because women are the most oppressed majority in the world. There were more women than men, but they're certainly put down. Improves education, helps children. It's a place where the voiceless can speak, and it does improve global communication. Now, this is just a very tiny sampling of what the United Nations does. It does a great deal more. And as I said before, when you start doing MUN conferences and go into committees, you will see that many of these will show up and you will learn more about them than ever before. Since its founding back in 1945, the United Nations has really been working to help make the world a better place. Most people speak about the failures of the United Nations, and it's not a perfect organization. There are failures and so forth. But for its problems, the world is a better place with it. So some of the milestones for the United Nations, and if you don't catch these down or write them down during class time, that's okay. This will be up probably in a few hours that you can stop the screen and then write them down on your own. It was in 1942 that they first used the term United Nations. And as I mentioned before, that was in the context of the war, not for an upcoming organization. Later, it would become the name of the organization. In 1945, in the Yalta Conference between the leaders of Soviet Union, United States, and Great Britain, this is where they came to an agreement, partial agreement, on the structure of the new United Nations. In April 1945, in San Francisco, they had the conference that formally helped to set up the United Nations. As we mentioned before, the charter was written mostly by Americans and then examined by the other allied nations, putting in their 2 cents worth, so to speak, and thus created the structure that we have today. In October of 1945, just a few months after the end of the Second World, in San Francisco, the United Nations Charter was ratified, and many leaders or representatives of the leaders of the world came to San Francisco for that. In January 1946, the United Nations met for the first time in London. It had been decided that the headquarters would be somewhere in the United States, although they did not know where it would be. Eventually, the United Nations would meet in the United States, believe it or not, in the Bronx at Fordham University. The very first Security Council was held in the gymnasium, and it was originally planned to have the headquarters for the United Nations to be up in upstate New York. They were practically going to create a brand new city. But then one of the Rockefellers donated a lot of land in New York City, and everybody said, this is where the United Nations is going to go. In December 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was printed, and this is one of the most important documents that humankind has ever come up with, because it's set up in black and white what all nations, what all people should be striving for. So if you're in a committee where you're dealing with human rights, let's say the right of religious minorities, this is the document that you would refer to over and over again. In June of 1950, the Security Council okayed the intervention in Korea. It's a fascinating story, and we'll look at that at another time. I made a mention of this, another fascinating thing that most people don't know about, the Suez Crisis. In August of 1963, the United Nations Security Council put the first sanctions against South Africa for their policy of apartheid. Apartheid was what was going on in the United States, where non-whites, so-called colored peoples and blacks, were not given equal access, equal jobs, and so forth. Just like in the United States, you had separate bathrooms. South Africa had it as well. You might find it ironic that the United States voted for sanctions against South Africa for something that we were doing here in this country, but no one would dare put sanctions against the United States because, well, the United States would veto it. A little bit of hypocrisy there. In November of 1967, the Security Council passed Resolution 242, an anti-Israeli resolution that made the search for an Israel, or Zionism, the equivalent of racism. That is still controversial today, although the Security Council many years later rescinded it. In 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was approved, and all the signatories, people who have signed in it, promised, cross their heart and hope to die, that they would not try to get nuclear weapons. Only the nations that had nuclear weapons were allowed to keep them, because, of course, the United States would not have approved it. Two notable exceptions to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was India and Pakistan, who a few years later came up with their own nuclear devices. Unfortunately, some nations who have signed it have reneged on it. Israel never publicly says it has nuclear weapons, but it's well known that they have about 40 of them. And of course, you know of North Korea, which said, well, we signed it, but too bad. What are you going to do about it? In 1971, Communist China was seated at the Security Council and the United Nations. Taiwan was ousted, and since then, Taiwan's status has been regulated to that of a non-state. In May of 1980, smallpox was officially eradicated. No one in the world could get smallpox in the wild, so to speak. The last place where smallpox was eradicated was in India, where villagers in one village where they worshipped an avatar of smallpox were forced to be inoculated. They literally had to tackle down people and inject them so they wouldn't get it anymore. The only places where smallpox exists is frozen in laboratories in Moscow and in Atlanta, Georgia, of all places. And they're there just in case something mutates that's close to smallpox. We would be able to emulate and create a vaccine, but a pretty nasty bit of business there. In December of 1985, the Law of the Sea Convention was approved, and that changed the borders of the world to include the oceans. As you can see here from the map in the purple, the territory, the territory of the sea goes out beyond the traditional 3-mile limit. Of course, the law of the sea is causing problems now because now China is using it as a way to claim territory that other nations say that's not theirs, that belongs to the Philippines or to the Vietnamese, and so forth. So that has yet to be figured out. September 1989, the Whitney Model United Nations was founded. And yes, I'm including that as a milestone. These are among the very first Whitney MUNers that we've had. This is, I think, out off of Cerritos are the winners that we had. All of these people, I think, went on to do good things. The guy way in the back, his thumb is up, the guy with the blondish hair. He's now a doctor of history. And I think he's teaching at some university, or he's teaching for the Pentagon. He just got married recently, had a kid. And I don't know about the rest of the kids, but none of them are like dead or anything, so that's pretty cool. In August of 1990, the Security Council backed the Persian War, which allowed the United States and its allied nations to go into Kuwait. In October 1993, the United Nations was humiliated in Somalia, where we were forced to leave that nation because everyone was violating all the rules that had been set up. In 1994, the United Nations approved airstrikes by NATO into Bosnia. This is something the United States had done in order to stop the genocide that was going on at the time. In June of 1995, the United Nations turned 50, and it's going to be turning 75 in just a few days. In March of 2004, the United States defied the Security Council, and we invaded Iraq. This is in the heels of 9/11, and some people saying we're still paying for what might have been a big mistake. In April of 2016, the United States signed the Paris Climate Agreement, and soon afterwards, with the presidency of Donald Trump, we left the Paris Agreement. But he also, in July of 2020, he set a date to end our membership in the World Health Organization over the handling of the virus. And the last United Nations milestone is right now, at 11:38. You're here, and you're part of that story as well. All right, so that ends it.